Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, the context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we are on Chapter 23, Section 5. Yesterday, we were on Section 4, which was pretty interesting, about nationalism threatening old empires. Those old empires, look it up, were problematic at the level of their inbreeding tendencies. The Habsburgs, that is. Look up the Habsburg jaw, or watch my video and then look it up. That'd be great. Please like and subscribe. My name is John Michael, and I'll be talking about other things when I finish this book that I'm 584 pages into. I'll see you around. Also, put this on for your dogs when you're away. It's great radio, ambient noise, so they can feel company while you're doing your necessary daily tasks that don't involve your dog. So choose the Context is Everything Media Network for your dog's listening pleasure as well as your own. Section 5, Chapter 23. Here we are. Russia, Reform, and Reaction. Setting the scene. Although serfdom had almost disappeared in Western Europe by the 1700s, its survival had spread in Russia. Masters exercised almost total power over their serfs. In the 1800s, a noble who became a revolutionary described the brutal treatment of serfs. This is a quote from Peter Kropotkin in the Memoirs of the Revolutionist. I heard stories of men and women torn from their families and their villages and sold or lost in gambling or exchange for a couple of hunting dogs, and then transported to some remote part of Russia to create a master's new estate. Of children taken from their parents and sold to cruel masters. Reformers hoped to free Russia from autocratic rule, economic backwardness, and social injustice, but efforts to modernize Russia had little success, as czars imprisoned critics or sent them into icy exile in Siberia. That's not good. Not good. New heading. Conditions in Russia. By 1815, Russia was not only the largest, most populous nation in Europe, but also a great world power. Since the 1600s, explorers had pushed the Russian frontier eastward across Siberia into the Pacific. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great had added lands in the Baltic and Black Seas, and czars in the 1800s had expanded into Central Asia. Russia had thus acquired a huge multinational empire, part European and part Asian. Other European nations looked on the Russian colossus or giant with a mixture of wonder and misgiving. It had immense natural resources. Russia's vast size gave it global interest and influence, but Western Europeans disliked its autocratic government and feared its expansionist aims. Obstacles to progress. Despite efforts by Peter and Catherine, the West, to westernize Russia, it remained economically undeveloped. By the 1800s, czars saw the need to modernize, but resisted reforms that would undermine their absolute rule. While the czars wavered, Russia fell further behind Western Europe in economic and social developments. A great obstacle to progress was the rigid social structure. Land-owning nobles dominated society and rejected any new change that would threaten their privileges. The middle class was too small to have much influence. The majority of Russians were serfs, laborers, bound to their lands, and the masters who controlled them. Serfdom continues on. Serfdom continues on. Wow. 1800s. Serfdom. Most serfs were peasants. They were peasants. Others might be servants, artisans, or soldiers forced into Tsar's armies. As industry expanded, some masters sent serfs to work in factories but took much of their pay. Many enlightened Russians knew that serfdom was ineffective. As long as most people had to serve the whim of their masters, Russia's economy would remain backward. Landowning nobles had no reason to improve agriculture and took little interest in industry. Russian absolutism. New heading. Russian absolutism. For centuries, Russia had ruled with absolute power, imposing their will on their subjects. The changes brought about by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution had almost no effect on Russian autocracy. Alexander I. While Alexander I inherited the throne in 1801, however, he seemed open to liberal ideas. The new Tsar eased censorship and promoted education, and even talked about freeing the serfs. By the time Napoleon had invaded Russia in 1812, Alexander had drawn back from reform. Like earlier Tsars, he feared losing the support of the nobles. At the Congress of Vienna, he joined the conservative powers in opposing liberal and nationalist impulses in Europe. Revolt and repression. When Alexander I died in 1825, a group of army officers led an uprising known as the Decembrist Revolt. They had picked up liberal ideas when fighting Napoleon in Western Europe, and now demanded a constitution and other reforms. The new Tsar, Nicholas I, suppressed the Decembrists and cracked down on all dissent. Nicholas used the police spies to hunt out critics. He banned books from Western Europe that might spread liberal ideas. Only approved textbooks were allowed in schools and universities. Many Russians with liberal or revolutionary ideas were judged to be insane and shut up in mental hospitals. Up to 150,000 were exiled to Siberia. Siberian Huskies. A lovely canine. I'm sure that they would enjoy this show if you're away doing your daily tasks, running an errand in a non-dog friendly establishment. It's better to have your dog home in their kennel rather than in the car in the hot summer. So choose the Context is Everything Media Network when you make the responsible decision and you go out and run errands. Put the Context is Everything Media Network. Go to my playlists. Let it run. Let it play. Your dog will thank you. Nicholas I and absolutism. To bolster his regime, Nicholas I embraced the three pillars of Russian absolutism, symbolized in the motto, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. Orthodoxy refers to the strong ties between the Russian Orthodox Church and the government. Autocracy was the absolute power of the state. Nationalism involved respect for Russian traditions and suppression of non-Russian groups within the empire. Still, Nicholas realized that Russia needed to modernize. He issued a new law code and made some economic reforms. He even tried to limit the power of landowners over serfs. But he could see no way to change the system completely without angering the Russian nobles and weakening the power of the Tsar. Before he died, he told his son, "I am handing you command of the country in a poor state." I'm handing you the power of this country in a poor state. Reforms of Alexander II. Alexander II came to the throne in 1855 during the Crimean War. The war had broken out after Russia tried to seize Ottoman lands along the Danube. Britain and France stepped in to help the Turks invading the Crimean Peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea. The war, which ended in a Russian defeat, revealed the country's backwardness. It had only a few miles of railroads, and the military bureaucracy was hopelessly inefficient. Many felt that the dramatic changes were needed. Emancipation. A widespread popular reaction followed. Liberals demanded changes, and students demonstrated for reform. Pressed from all sides, Alexander II finally agreed to reforms. In 1861, he issued a royal decree that required emancipation, or freeing, of the serfs. Freedom brought problems. Former serfs had to buy the land that they had worked for so long. Many were too poor to do so. Also, the lands allotted to peasants were often too small to farm efficiently or to support a family. As a result, peasants remained poor, and discontent festered. Still, emancipation was a turning point. Many peasants moved to the cities, taking jobs in factories and building Russian industries. Equally important, freeing the serfs boosted the drive for further reform. Other reforms. Along with emancipation, Alexander set up a system of local government. Elected assemblies called zemstvos, Zemstvos, were made responsible for matters such as road repair, schools, and agriculture. At the local level, at least, Russians gained some experience of self-government. The Tsar also introduced legal reforms based on ideas such as the trial by jury. He eased censorship and tried to reform the military. A soldier's term of service was reduced from what? A soldier's term of service was reduced from 25 years to 15. The brutal discipline was limited. Brutal discipline to the soldiers, clearly. Alexander was encouraged, and Alexander also encouraged the growth of industry in Russia, which still relied almost entirely on agriculture. A movement to liberate women also swept the urban centers of Russia. Since they were denied education in Russia, hundreds of privileged young women left their homes and families to study abroad in a few universities that would accept them. Many came to support revolutionary goals. New heading. Reaction to change. Alexander's reforms failed to satisfy many Russians. Peasants had freedom but not land. Liberals wanted a constitution and an elected legislature. Radicals who had adopted socialist ideas from the West demanded even more revolutionary changes. The Tsar, in the meantime, moved away from reform and towards repression. Revolutionary currents. In the 1870s, some socialists carried the message of reform to the peasants. They went to live and work among the peasants, sometimes preaching rebellion. These educated young men and women had little success. The peasants scarcely understood them and sometimes turned them over to the police. The failure of this "go to the people" movement, combined with the renewed government repression, sparked anger among radicals. Some turned to terrorism. A revolutionary group called itself the People's Will, assassinated officials and plotted to kill the Tsar. Their first attempts failed. Then, on a cold March day in 1881, terrorists hurled 2 bombs at Alexander's carriage. One struck down several guards. The second killed the leader, known to some as the Tsar Emancipator. Okay. Crackdown. Alexander III responded to his father's assassination by reviving the harsh methods of Nicholas I. To wipe out liberals and revolutionaries, he increased the power of the secret police, restored strict censorship, and exiled critics to Siberia. He relied on his advisor and former tutor, Konstantin Podolonostiev, who rejected all talk of democracy and constitutional government as the lies of the hollow and flabby people. The lies of hollow and flabby people. The Tsar also launched a program of Russification aimed at suppressing the cultures of non-Russian people within the empire. Alexander insisted on one language, Russian, and one church, the Russian Orthodox Church. Poles, Ukrainians, Finns, Armenians, and many others suffered persecution in the Russification campaign, also targeted Jews and Muslims in the empire. I mean, to play a bit of a cynic, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if you wanted to really gain power back, if you're Alexander III, to plot the assassination of your father with those bombs so that you can say, I don't like this guy being so lenient on people. I'm going to kill him and then make everything really strict, with the justification that people are getting a little bit too liberal with their bomb throwing. We need to quash rebellion. I have no idea. I'm guessing. I'm not even saying I'm right. I'm not even saying that that's what I think. Just saying that that is something that I did think as I was reading it, that it's possible. Because wouldn't power want more power if you're in an autocracy? I'm just telling you what the book's telling you. Persecution and pogroms, Pogroms. Russia had acquired a large Jewish population when it carved up Poland and expanded into Ukraine. Under Alexander III, persecution of Russian Jews increased. The Tsar limited the number of Jews who were allowed to study in universities and practice professions such as law and medicine. He revived old laws that forced Jews to live in certain restricted areas. Official persecution encouraged pogroms or violent mobs, attacks on Jews. Gangs beat and killed Jews and looted and burned their homes and stores. The police did nothing to stop the violence. Faced with savage persecution, many Jews escaped from Russia. They became refugees or people who flee from their homeland to seek safety elsewhere. large numbers of Russian Jews went on to the United States. Though they often faced prejudice of great hardships there, they were safe from pogroms and official persecution. Jewish immigrants sent joyful news back to Russia. There is no Tsar in America. Correct? Building Russian industry. New heading. Under Alexander III and his son, Nicholas II, Russia finally entered the industrial age. In the 1890s, Count Sergei Witte financed ministry. In the 1890s, Count Sergei Witte, finance minister to Nicholas, focused on economic development. Witte encouraged railroad building to connect iron and coal mines with factories and to transport goods across Russia. He secured foreign capital. Where am I? He secured foreign capital. To invest in transportation systems and industry. Loans from France helped build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Begun in 1890s, it linked European Russia to the Pacific Ocean. The drive to industrialize increased political and social problems. Government officials and business leaders applauded and encouraged economic growth. Nobles and peasants opposed it, fearing the changes brought by the new ways. Industrialization also created new social ills, as peasants flocked to cities to work in factories. Instead of better life, they found long hours and low pay in dangerous conditions. In the slums around the factories, poverty, disease, and discontent multiplied. Radicals sought supporters among new industrial workers. At factory gates, socialists handed out pamphlets that preached the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx. Among revolutionaries in the 1890s was a young Vladimir Ulyanov. Ulyanov. Probably should know his name. I don't. Whose older brother had been executed for plotting to kill Alexander III. Like many revolutionaries, Ulyanov used an alias or false name, Lenin. Oh, I guess I didn't know his name. In 1917, Lenin would take power in a revolution that transformed Russia. This is important. Turning point. New heading. Crisis and revolution. War broke out between Russia and Japan in 1904. Nicholas II called his people to fight for the faith, the Tsar, and the fatherland. But despite their efforts, the Russians suffered one humiliating defeat after another. The Peaceful March. News of the military disasters unleashed pent-up discontent created by years of oppression. Protesters poured into the streets. Workers went on strike with demands of shorter hours and better wages. Liberals called for constitution and reformers to overhaul the inefficient, corrupt government. As the crisis deepened, a young Orthodox priest, Father George Gapon, organized a march for Sunday, January 22nd, 1905. Father Gapon felt certain that the Little Fathers, as many Russians called the Tsar, would help his people if they understood their suffering. The parade followed through the icy streets of St. Petersburg towards the Tsar's lavish winter palace. Chanting prayer and singing hymns, workers carried holy icons and pictures of the Tsar. They also brought a petition for justice and freedom, which was addressed to Nicholas. Bloody Sunday. Fearing the marchers, The Tsar had fled the palace and called in soldiers. As the people approached, they saw troops lined up across the square. Suddenly, gunfire rang out. Men and women ran and fell. More shots left hundreds dead or wounded in the snow. A woman stumbling away from the scene of the massacre moaned, "The Tsar has deserted us. They shot away the Orthodox faith." Indeed, the slaughter marked a turning point for Russians. Bloody Sunday killed the people's faith and trust in the Tsar. Well, it certainly sounds like that's something that'll kill the faith and trust in a leader. Yeah. The Revolution of 1905. In the months following Bloody Sunday, discontent exploded across Russia. Strikes multiplied. In some cities, workers took over local government. The countryside peasants revolted and demanded land. Minority nationalities called for autonomy from Russia, demanded land. Called for autonomy from Russia. Terrorists targeted officials, and some assassins were cheered as heroes by discontented Russians. At last, the clamor grew so great that Nicholas was forced to announce sweeping reforms. In the October manifesto, he promised freedom for person, conscience, speech, assembly, and union. He agreed to summon a Duma, or elected national legislature. No law, he declared, would go into effect without approval by the Duma. Results of the revolution. And this is the end of our time today. Thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe. And thank you for being here. The manifesto won over moderates, leaving socialists isolated. These divisions helped the Tsar, who had no intention of letting strikers, revolutionaries, and rebellious peasants challenge him. In 1906, the first Duma met, but the Tsar quickly dissolved it when leaders criticized the government. Nicholas then appointed a new prime minister, Peter Stolypin. Arrests, pogroms, and executions followed as the conservative Stolypin sought to restore order. Stolypin soon realized that Russia needed reform, not just repression. To regain peasant support, he introduced moderate land reforms. He strengthened the zemstvos and improved education. These reforms were too limited to meet the broad needs of most Russians. Dissatisfaction still simmered. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911. Several more Dumas met during this period, but new voting laws made sure that they were conservative. By 1914, Russia was still an autocracy simmering with unrest. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the day. Enjoy the weather. God bless. Goodbye. Sounds like we're getting on the verge of World War I.